Thank you, everybody, for coming. As it says, today I'm going to talk to you about how my team and I are ensuring the Fortune 1's success with Apple. I'm Miles Lacey. If we haven't met yet, as Patrick mentioned, this is my second year here, but I've been around the community for a bit and have gotten to meet and learn from quite a few of the fine folks in the room, and thank you all for that. In my past, I've managed Macs and Apple devices for many years across many different organizations, types of organizations, K-12, higher education, small business, up to now global businesses, governments, and going back, and thanks to Marco's slide taking me down memory lane a bit, I started my Mac world back in System 607. So that was a lot of fun looking back at some of that stuff. That's who I am. Quick rundown of what I'm going to be talking about here today. I'm going to touch a little bit on our Walmart culture, and this sort of informs how we go about things. We're going to talk a little bit about total cost of ownership and how that drives some of our decisions. We're going to go over best practices that we find. Some we find are best practices in general, some we find are best practices based on our set of requirements and environmental concerns. We're going to run through a few hurdles that we find as we go through trying to achieve that success and what we're looking to the future to achieve. So digging into that Walmart culture, who is Walmart? Well, if you see any of our ads, we help people save money to live better, right? And our focus is on the customer, and that's very apparent in our day-to-day work in the office. The goal is to bring that value to the customer, and like I've always seen IT is not a goal for most organizations, right? IT is a necessary function. Walmart's goal is to sell stuff to people at good prices, not to do IT stuff. And so we want to minimize the IT stuff that we inflict on the organization. Okay. Now, what is Walmart? Right? We are the Fortune 1 for the past several years. We're the world's largest private employer with 2.3 million employees, last I checked the statistics. Now, that doesn't mean 2.3 million Macs. That includes store employees, truck drivers, what have you. But still quite a few knowledge workers that we deal with, and many of whom use Apple products. According to Forbes, world's largest retailer, and then we're a global enterprise that was founded back in 1962. So we've been around for 56 years. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of baggage. There's a lot of ways we've always done things before. And if you've heard the metaphor of turning the battleship, there's a lot of that going on. So we find that we make progress sometimes more slowly than we would like because we do need to turn that 56-year-old battleship. So I'm not going to run through each of these, but our founder, Sam Walton, had written this business book about his journey and successes in building the business. And we are going to touch throughout the presentation on a couple of these rules for building a business. If you're interested in the book, it's available at walmart.com. And you can read that on the slides later at your leisure. But the first piece that we're going to pick out is Rule 9, right? So Rule 9 is control your expenses better than your competition. And what that breaks out into is our everyday low prices. And as you can see, during one of my store visits, the signage for everyday low prices everywhere. You're going to see that all up and down the aisles throughout the stores. And that translates to one of our tenets as we're doing our work is everyday low cost in order to bring those everyday low prices to the consumer. So this informs our purchases. This informs, are we going to do this project? Are we going to buy this next tool? Do we want to try to leverage something open source? Do we want to find some other way to save a bit of money? And that kind of dovetails very nicely into some stuff that you may have heard from other big organizations in the past few years, right? And that goes to the total cost of ownership of a Mac. And you've probably heard some of these presentations where folks will talk about, well, it's this much less, or these are the numbers. I don't have specific numbers to go into, but I've got some general concepts, right? So given our everyday low-cost guidance, we find that deploying a Mac is the same or less TCO than deploying another platform. Don't have a number to share here, but it is the same or less. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing it, right? Some of the factors that go into that is our engineering to staff ratio. As I'm sure you've seen in other presentations, you need far fewer folks to manage an Apple fleet than you do to manage certain other operating systems, right? The tools are a bit easier to deal with, and there's a nice community here where we all help each other out. There are, of course, fewer licenses, and the support ratio we found through ticketing data across all of our different organizations around the world and normalizing for population numbers is about 60% of all tickets come from PC users, 40% come from Macs. So there's a definite support savings there. Okay. Now, there is one very clear item in the cons column, and that's, again, the 56-year-old Battleship has quite a few legacy processes, a lot of which are required for certain business functions, and that forces us to do things maybe not 100% the way we want to, or 100% to the latest technologies and tools that are out there. So that's sort of the cost side of it, right? It does make sense. And we're doing this to help save money and also give folks that great Apple user experience. As we go through, I don't know what happened when I came here. My slides changed somehow. But going through a few best practices, I want to touch on each of these points here. So as we go to macOS, right, we think of versions. We've got N-2, right, where N is being the current release. That has typically, for the past several years, been what Apple supports, what you're going to be able to get patches and security updates for. And so that's something that we standardized on a few years ago, that you will not get support, and in certain areas, you will not get the latest installs or access to certain tools if your system is not running an OS within that N-2. So N-2 today, of course, would take us back to Sierra. And all the obvious reasons, right? Security, feature availability, management tool availability, right? As I'm sure you've heard from a lot of folks already this week, and you're well aware, Apple releases new hooks, new MDM payloads, new things in each major release. And so as admins, we want to have access to that to help make the user experience a bit better and satisfy whatever requirements we've got. However, this year, things got a little complicated. Some of you may have noticed Microsoft put out in their system requirements for Office 365 subscription and Office 2019 perpetual licenses that they're only supporting N-1, right, for those latest releases. So are we. We just went ahead with that because folks want to be able to use those tools. They want to be able to use those apps. And rather than explain to somebody why I don't have the latest feature in Outlook or PowerPoint or what have you, I'm going to tell them, you need to update, right? It's just a natural part of life. We never hold back our updates, and I'll get into that a little bit in a little bit. We keep our updates automated. We try to keep the entire fleet on that N-1 now, which was N-2 just shortly ago. And as of the Friday that I left to come out here, last Friday, the 30th of September, our fleet was over 98.8% within N-1. So we've done a pretty good job keeping them there and socially engineering them to want to go there. So, and part of that is we're partnering with our security teams and looking towards gating certain features, such as if you're on Yosemite, for example, you're not allowed on the network anymore, right? Or you're not going to get the next app update. So very easy to do with a lot of the management tools that we all use. So I want to touch back on another one of Sam's rules. All right, so rule 4, we want to communicate everything we can possibly communicate to our partners, meaning anybody that we work with, whether it's internal, external. We want to help each other achieve our goals, right? Because at the end of the day, our goals are the same, and that's to help the business. So a great example of that was what I was just talking about as far as that N-1 change. Our team internally that's responsible for Office and my team came together, discussed this. It was pretty obvious. This is a thing that had to happen. But it wasn't just Miles or the Mac management team. It wasn't just the Office team either. It was the whole group coming together and putting that forth to the business saying, this needs to be a new standard because otherwise we have problems. So allies are always great, especially when you're trying to turn that battleship. So, touched on this a moment ago. macOS day of release. So we support every macOS update, whether it's a point update, right, 10.13.5 to 10.13.6, or to 10.14. Everything is supported the day it's released. If it turns up in the App Store, we're ready to go. Everything that we can control, we've dealt with. Everything that is out of our control, we have discussed with the vendors or internal developers and at least have an answer for the user when those things come up. We do very aggressively work with our vendors and our internal developers. At Developers Conference every summer, Apple releases a beta, right? So we've got several months to play with that beta. Now, granted, this year, as a lot of us encountered, sometimes things change during the beta, sometimes things change late in the beta, but we're still working that beta, right? And we roll with those punches as we need to. And this gives us a bunch of benefits, right? We don't have to, as some organizations, in fact, this organization in the past, would, on announcement of a new OS, call up the reseller and say, okay, I want to stockpile a bunch of pallets of old computers so that I can keep running the old OS. That is problematic for a bunch of reasons, right? I don't want to issue aging computers to new employees. I don't want to reduce the usable lifespan of those computers. And the OS itself, especially as we're adopting this N-1 OS paradigm, if I don't adopt Mojave until halfway through its usable life, then that's a lot of missed opportunity, right? Just like a major release, we also run through testing and partnership with our developers on the minor releases, right? So our project to certify all of our third-party and internal software on 10.14.1 is already well underway. All right, as soon as that beta was released, the project started up. And that is just an ongoing project forever. All right. Now, sometimes you have a situation where a particular piece of software isn't going to be ready. Okay, and we'll get into what we do there a little bit later on. Right. So primarily, when we're preparing for that day of release, we want to inform and empower our users. Right. So we keep an internal web page of from Developers Conference up until and after and throughout the release of the operating system, a list of the software. Has it been vetted? Are there known issues? What are they? Are there links to KBs? Is everything fine? Right, so we use sort of a red, green, yellow sort of traffic light scenario there, and ensure that folks are informed. So for example, if I need, spiffy app X as part of my daily work, and I go take a look at this page and I see, oh, well, spiffy app X just doesn't work, or it has a couple of major issues. Maybe I'm not going to update to Mojave quite yet. But for folks that use a lot of the standard software, what we call our sort of core and essential software, which would be things like Office, teleconferencing tools, things like that, then I'm going to be fine. I'm just going to click that button in the App Store and get the latest stuff. Thinking about documentation, right? So we need to keep that info up to date, and it's not just sort of this page for the users. We want to make sure that our support teams are very well informed of what is what. What are those issues in great detail so they can either address them or advise the users as to what the state is. And that partnership, again, constant and ongoing, weekly meetings, and constant communications. Okay. That's sort of what we do with the OS. Now, for other software, kind of touched on already, we hold our internal and third-party developers accountable to Apple standards. So that means sandboxing, code signature, all of the standard components that you would expect. In fact, we don't publish much of our internal software in the App Store at all, but our developers are instructed to behave as if they need to pass App Store review. Right? These things need to be compliant with the OS, makes it easier for us to deploy them, makes it easier for the user to have a great user experience. It also looks forward to things like we know at some future point everything's going to need to be notarized. So that is now part of every internal developer's workflow, notarize your code, wherever possible at this point. There are exceptions, but this is the ideal we hold to, and we make it very clear to a developer that asks for an exception that they're putting themselves in a bad spot, right? Because at some point, Apple's going to make a change. Some of these things are telegraphed well ahead of time, but Apple's going to make that change, and then their code doesn't work anymore. And when that happens, the user's upset, we're upset, everybody's upset, people can't get their work done. So, and as we look at sort of that telegraphing, I'm sure most of us are aware, when Apple talks about, hey, there's this new thing we're doing, usually it'll come out as an optional thing, right? Hey, this is a good idea. We want to try this out. And then if that works out, eventually you're going to hear, well, this is recommended, right? You should probably be looking at this. You should probably do this. Eventually it might get called best practice or words to that effect. And then shortly thereafter, it may become a requirement. So it's one thing a lot of us here are probably pretty good at, but we need to help our partners be good at, sort of reading that writing on the wall, so to speak, where these things do progress as they work out from a good idea to a recommendation to a hard requirement. And if you're not keeping up with that, then that's going to give us a lot of problems. So that was talking about development, talking about sticking to the rules of the platform. When we talk about deployment, this is another thing that is a constant conversation with a lot of vendors that we deal with. And we want, as a baseline, any software that we purchase to be available through the App Store. We want to deploy it through VPP. We don't want to think about it. We don't want to deal with the package. We don't want to upload it into our management system and worry about how we're going to deploy it, right? Failing that, we expect a package that is properly signed to be delivered by that vendor. And then if the vendor ends up giving us some collection of files that we're supposed to figure out how to deliver, then we have a slightly more harsh conversation with that vendor. We really feel that it is the vendor's job to provide the installation mechanism. And so I've had some vendors hand me a folder that's got a script and a bunch of non-standard data files in it, and I've told them, okay, you just created work for me, and that's not why I'm giving you money, right? So, but if we have to, right, we are a Jamf shop, right, we'll use Composer, or depending on exactly what it is we're dealing with, maybe another tool, but probably Composer to build ourselves a package and deal with that. But you can bet that we're talking to whoever's purchasing, and we're influencing that contract negotiation by the fact that we've put in X number of hours to do the vendor's job. Okay. The other thing that we press for, and again, this is why we prefer the App Store, is automated update mechanisms, right? We want things to automatically update in the App Store, just like the OS, right? So we want the latest versions of Office. We want the latest versions of every title that we deploy. And those betas are similarly tested, but the goal is that we're ready to go the minute that release goes public. And again, we don't want to invest our hours and our team's effort in building an update mechanism, right? Apple provides a lovely one. Please use that, is sort of the first ask to the vendor. Failing that, give us your own that works well. So Microsoft is a good example of that, as we heard from earlier this week. Okay. Another piece that's becoming a very important deliverable, and another place where a lot of vendors are starting to make work for us, maybe over the past year or so, is profiles, right? So just like providing a properly built and signed package is something that we feel is the vendor's responsibility, when we look at things such as kernel extensions and TCC or PPPC, we feel that that profile is on the vendor to provide, right? That is a deliverable component that is required to make that vendor's software operate as advertised. So why aren't they supplying those profiles, or at least a profile template or example? All right, why are we sitting there in those last few weeks poring over the documentation that's available and handwriting profiles? Why? Because we had to. We had to because the vendors aren't doing it, which we feel is their responsibility. Okay. Next piece we look at, and again, this is per our requirements, per that everyday low cost, DEP, User Approved MDM. We really don't feel that that's optional, right? You don't get all of your management options without them. And it seems, again, reading that writing on the wall, we may not get any in the future at some point if we're not using one or the other of these. So DEP is our standard. User Approved is our fallback in certain areas where it's not available, which are getting fewer and fewer, or where we might have some sort of bump or hiccup in getting the program going in that particular area. But again, going to that compliance criteria, not being user approved or DEP is another one of those criteria, like being further back than, at this point, High Sierra, that might get you restricted from networks or software deployments. Next piece we've got, Jamf Pro. We spend the money on this. Again, we're a Jamf shop, and as I'm sure folks who know me know, I spent a lot of time as a Jamf employee and as a Jamf customer, both before and after my time as an employee. However, before I bought Jamf the first time all those years ago, and while I was working at the company, and since being a customer, I've done my due diligence, evaluated the product, evaluated competing products, and for my set of requirements and my organization's set of requirements, this is found to be the best choice. Doesn't necessarily mean it will be the best choice forever. Doesn't necessarily mean there aren't other sets of requirements where another choice would make sense. But that's where we go and are constantly evaluating. We do feel it's best of breed, and we prefer that mindset over a single pane of glass mindset, where something like maybe AirWatch, and I don't recall the new product name, right? If your priority is single pane of glass, that's an excellent tool, right? You can manage all sorts of operating systems. But that's how that goes. Another point that might be worth evaluating based on some things we heard this week is another tool we use. That's Enterprise Connect, right? So I have it on some authority that I haven't fully verified yet, that I know in the past this has been limited availability outside the US. I'm told that's changing. I don't have details. I will say talk to your Apple reps about that. I don't work for Apple. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth here. But the basics are, it simplifies your AD interactions, and it lets you maintain Kerberos tickets, reset passwords, things like this, whether or not you're bind to Active Directory. My advice would be don't. But again, it's your own set of requirements to evaluate there. The reason we tend towards don't is because Active Directory bindings are not a great idea when you're dealing with a mobile device, and a mobile device includes a laptop, right? If you've got a Mac Pro, an iMac that's constantly wired into the network, your AD binding is probably going to be really stable. If you have a computer that travels all over your country, all over the world, I take my Mac over here to Gothenburg, I'm going to lose my binding at some point. Okay. So again, talk to your Apple rep. Also, from what we heard today, talk to your Jamf rep and see what those alternatives are, or open source alternatives as well. The next point I want to get to, speaking of open source, and I don't want to reinvent the wheel. Now, there are a great many open source products that are amazing and that do a lot of good and necessary work, and that we ourselves incorporate into our workflows. But what we try to be careful of is we separate what is filling a gap, what is providing a function or a service or a tool that we don't already have or that isn't being provided to us by Apple, by Jamf, Microsoft, whoever might be involved in that particular item, and what is duplicating that functionality. So that's what we want to shy away from. So to use extreme examples, right, I wouldn't try to rewrite APNS, right? Apple's got that done, right? The APNS is available all over the globe, that's fine. I don't need to do anything about that. But maybe patch management, right? Maybe I look at what Jamf has, maybe I look at Monkey, maybe I look at something else, maybe I create my own. But that's really the line that I look at. Am I reinventing the wheel? If I am, maybe I shouldn't be. And if I'm thinking of reinventing the wheel, maybe I'm thinking, oh, Apple has this thing, it's kind of good, but it doesn't do exactly what I want. I'm reminded again of Marco's wonderful presentation. With all the research into how these things work, there's a lot of guesswork, right, if you're reverse engineering something that isn't well documented. So when I'm using guesswork and trial and error, I could certainly miss something, right? I can do a little bit of reverse engineering, and maybe under the conditions that I've tested, I find X seems to work. But I could not have possibly tested every condition. And if I don't know how the thing is supposed to work definitively, how can I recreate it? Okay. The other thing is we want to avoid creating unnecessary technical debt for ourselves. So even if it is a necessary gap filler, we give that a thought, is what's it going to take to maintain this? And is having it worth all of that effort going forward? Okay. So coming back to Sam's rules, right, exceed your customers' expectations, and we've got many classes of customers. There's, of course, the Walmart customer who's shopping in our stores or online. We've got our partner teams, and then we've got every associate that we're providing services to and Macs to. So we want to make sure that we are informing everybody. We want to make sure that we're providing technology that helps the associate get their job done. We want to make sure that we are collaborating with our partner teams even when we disagree. So it's a very natural reaction sometimes where you'll get a team who will come in and say, hey, we need to do this. And that thing they're suggesting makes no sense, or it makes sense to you, but it seems insane. And so the initial reaction for a lot of folks is just sort of get very defensive, say, no, we should never do that. But in those situations, I want to make sure that we sort of suppress that initial reaction and make sure that we're first collaborating. So maybe what they're suggesting seems insane, but I want to take a step back and figure out, well, why are you suggesting that? What's your goal? Because maybe when we understand the goal, we can find a more sane way to get there. So somebody might have a piece of software that we know doesn't work very well or causes problems, and they're telling us, oh, we must deliver this software. But if we find out why, then maybe we have an alternative to offer, a different software package or a different process entirely. So a lot of times, psychology is greater than technology. So. Next, I want to address some of the hurdles we deal with. Right? So we do have this old Windows-centric environment. We have a fair bit of bureaucracy, being this large, old, global organization. So we've got standards and documentation. We, of course, deal with our everybody's favorite two topics, security and networking. And we want to make sure that we're dealing with these effectively, and also, once again, we're keeping our support teams armed and informed to deal with what they need to deal with. So, of course, in our Windows-centric environment, this gives us some opportunities for growth and change. Certainly, we've got issues around Active Directory that we've touched on. There are certificate issuance concepts that come up, and thanks to the folks at Jamf for some of the work that they've just spoken about. And the good news on this point is that Windows is also changing. Right? So if you're following the latest news on Windows, they're becoming more into open standards. They're becoming less tolerant of legacy cruft. And that's a great way where we can partner up with our associates on the Windows side to say, oh, hey, this legacy thing that's causing us problems, how's that working out for you? Oh, it doesn't work in Windows 10? Okay, well, let's all go to that guy and explain it. Okay. So our next rule from Sam, swimming upstream. Right? If we look at this, this might sound similar to another CEO who some of us might have various levels of love for. Right? This sounds very similar to that Think Different campaign that was so famous from Apple. Right? So we do want to challenge the way we've always done things. Just because a decision was the right decision last year, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, certainly doesn't mean it continues to be the right decision forever. So we always want to question. We always want to make sure we're still doing the right thing. So that was very heartening as a sort of lifelong Apple person, coming in through my Walmart orientation, seeing some of this stuff. I was like, yeah, okay. This sort of big monolith, but I think I can work with this. I think they get it. So. Coming into standards, right? So we want to make sure that we're codifying our practices, processes, guidelines. And this is really the boring stuff, but it's so necessary. certainly at scale, but even in a small shop. If I was in the past running an IT department for an organization that supported 200 users, I could probably keep everything in my head, and I could probably answer every question that came along. But what if I'm sick? What if I want to go on vacation? What if I leave the company? That's not very good to whoever comes after me. So we want to make sure that we're being very clear about our documentation, and we build documentation into every project from the start, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But building into any of that documentation, standards, practices, and even project documentation, in that initial build, we build in a review period, right? So we know from the inception of the project, from the release of the project, that we're going to come back and revisit this in 90 days, 30 days, 2 years, whatever we think is appropriate for that given project. But that's baked in. It's tagged on the document. It's gone into people's calendars and people's workflows. Okay. So, security. It's very important, obviously. We hear about threats all the time. Of course, we hear from Apple and their stance on the seriousness they put on security and privacy. And again, in a large organization, you've got legal compliance issues to deal with, and we want to make sure that we are that partner for the security teams. We want to make sure that we're helping them deliver a secure platform. Now, that means both making sure that we're open to learning from our security partners, but also that we're able to teach them about Apple platforms. So somebody might, again, come in, oh, we need to deploy product X, or we need to change setting Y. And we need to back that up sometimes and figure out, well, why are you doing that? What's the threat you're trying to respond to? And once we know that, we can evaluate, is that a threat that exists on this platform? If it is, what is the best way to respond to it on this platform, which might be different from other platforms? Okay. But at the end of the day, we do have those common goals, and we always come back and refer to that. Okay. When we get into networking, networking is really just about ensuring that we can access all the appropriate things, right? So we've heard several times about how in order to install or upgrade macOS these days, you must have an internet connection. And we've got all these various services and tools that are reliant on being able to communicate to the network, to the internet rather. And it'll vary depending on the products you're using. And this ends up being a very complicated conversation in a larger organization, right? There are security elements that come into play, but also in a globally distributed organization, not necessarily all networks are managed from the same point. So I might have to go have a chat with some folks in the US, and then I might have to go have that same chat with folks in the UK and various other places to make sure we have a seamless, unified experience for the user, right? Because we don't want somebody from California to travel to London, and now they can't update macOS. Okay. Again, when we look at support, we build that documentation and training into every project from the beginning. So training could be as simple as a document, a short video, or it could be a presentation, it could be a class. Depends on how complex the topic is. And every project begins with a flowchart. So when we decide we're going to take on a project, whoever's going to own that project is given that task. Bring a flowchart to the next meeting, and we're going to figure out how are you going to get your thing done, right? How are we going to accomplish this? And then this helps us visualize what's going on. It helps us build the documentation out. It helps us build the project out when we know what all the components are, as opposed to sort of free-forming, sending some smart guy into a closed room and banging out some code for a while. We want to make sure we know what our goals are right up front. And when we look at the documentation, we have up to 3 documents for every project deployment and process. And those are for engineers, for support teams, for end users. And it's evaluated on a per project basis, whether we need all 3. Sometimes we only need 1, sometimes 2, sometimes all 3. But we want to make sure that the user knows what's going on, the user knows how to use the workflow that's been developed. We want to make sure support knows how to respond to any issues that may come up, or even if the project or product is working flawlessly, that they can explain it to a user. And then finally, for engineers, when it comes time to reevaluate, rebuild that, we need folks to know what was built, why, and how, which is especially important if I decide to go away or some other team members decide to go away. Okay. So coming back to Sam's rules again, motivate your partners. So this is where we make sure that we're being team players, regardless of any particular momentary frustration, right? Our goals are to serve the customer, to serve our users, and to provide a good platform. So we want to make sure we're helping our partners win. If I've got some security team with an audit requirement they have to satisfy, I'm going to help them get that done. And that has the great effect, right? Thinking of basic psychology concepts, I just help them achieve their goal. They're going to be more willing to discuss helping me achieve some of my goals, or maybe reevaluating some of their ingrained thought processes. Okay. And once again, at the end of the day, we want to make sure we are focused on service delivery to our user. And sometimes that means managing up, down, and sideways, making sure that we're informing our leadership, make sure we're informing our partner teams of the information that they need to have to make a good decision. So you might have a CEO or a CISO or some VP, they've read an article, and from this article, they've got what they believe is a good idea, and very well may be. Maybe it isn't, or maybe they need to consider how to go about achieving that idea. And so that's sort of our role, is not to tell our leaders no, but to tell our leaders how and why, and helping them understand if what they think is a good idea really is a good idea. Okay. So this is how we've gotten where we've gotten, right? We've got our N-1. We're deploying all of our software to the latest versions pretty much at all times. And we're working closely with our vendors to make sure that we're providing the latest in the most supportable fashion as quickly as possible. But we've got a few things coming up, right? So I'm not going to mention any numbers, but MacOS Choice is an aggressive target that we have coming up in the very near future. Where currently, if a new associate comes in, if they want a Mac, it's typically only given to them if they work in a certain department or if their supervisor approves. That's going to be changing very shortly. Again, I don't have a date to announce on that either, but we do have a very aggressive time frame on this, to where when you walk in the door, you decide, do I want a Windows computer? Do I want a Mac? And I just get it. We're also, we're sort of at one touch at this point, but our goal is to get to 0 touch anywhere on the planet. So I could open up a shrink wrap box here in this conference and set up a new computer as a Walmart associate, or I could do it in Starbucks or in a Walmart office. All right, shouldn't matter. And we're getting very close to that. Just need to solve that one last touch. And then I touched on earlier, release gating based on criteria, right? So if you're not N-1, if you're missing a required setting, we're working with our various partners, our security partners, as well as teams responsible for other applications and services, to further gate these products and services, so that if you are not in what we call the compliance group, or if you're in the opposite of what we call the naughty group, right? You either don't get the deployment or you have that thing revoked, right? And so that ties back to a lot of the security concepts, but also providing that carrot and stick for the users who are a bit slower to update, right? Well, you know, Mojave's out now, you're running El Capitan, that's beyond N-1, you need to update. If that's all I say, that's going to happen with some folks, with some computers, whenever they feel like it. If I tell you Outlook is going to get uninstalled in 30 days if you don't update, they're probably going to update. So that's sort of what we're looking at. When we look at that Zero Touch Anywhere, our goal there is self-configuration anywhere. It's the dream, right? It's the there is no step 3, right? Post-it note on the box. And our goal there is several 9s of reliability on that process. Okay. And with that, thank you for listening. And anybody have any questions on what we're doing? I may have to demur particular numbers or things like that, but I'm happy to take your questions.
This is mostly actually a comment. You mentioned the Apple Enterprise Connect tool. You cannot contact your Apple representative here in Europe or anywhere else because it's only available in the United States. So unless your company has a division or department over there and is registered, you cannot get it in Europe.
I know that has been the case for a while. I spoke to somebody who shall not be named at Apple recently, and I was told this is changing.
It's changing now in
It's changing.
October.
Okay, it's changing in October. Okay, cool.
Just a clarification about Office 365 support. There was indeed an announcement about N-1 being our policy, but in fact our policy is N-2. So I'm glad you were able to use Office 365 as a motivating factor. Yes. So well done.
Thank you for being the carrot, but shh, and please edit that comment out.
Anyone else? Anyone else? It was interesting, wasn't it? Yeah. Well, so we're going to meet back here at what time? 5:10. And in the meantime, you have time to go out to the Jamf booth down there and get your raffle tickets if you haven't got them already. And if you have got them already, you can probably get another one if you don't tell them that you already got another one. So, but thank you, Miles.